and welcome back to another episode of Indigenous Peoples' Voices. Today, I am pleased to share some great news, particularly a significant victory uh, for the indigenous peoples worldwide, which was achieved on October 6th, 2025, during the 60th session of the Human Rights Council. On this day, the United Nations Human Rights Council, the UN's top human rights body, which passed a landmark resolutions unanimously without a single objections during the recently held 60th session of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, Switzerland. This consensus demonstrates the global community's recognitions of the importance of indigenous peoples' rights and the need for the concrete actions to ensure those rights are fulfilled. In this video, I will try to explain what this resolution contains and why it is so important for indigenous peoples around the world. The first and primary feature of this historic resolution emphasizes the active and meaningful participation of indigenous peoples in United Nations meetings and conferences. The resolution states that active participations will be ensured for indigenous peoples through their duly established institutions and representatives from all 7 socio-cultural regions across the world. Therefore, the resolution is more than a symbolic statement. It's a strong commitment from the United Nations to ensure that indigenous peoples' voices are respected and included at every level of global decision making. The resolution further states that indigenous peoples will not merely be included as guests or observers. Instead, their participation will be guaranteed as decision makers in all the programs, policy making, and negotiations that be held within the United Nations. The goal is to create an environment where the real life experiences and perspective of indigenous peoples are presented in these policy processes and the programs. The resolutions also directs the President of the Human Rights Council to ensure the participation of indigenous peoples and also calls for capacity building and training to ensure the active and effective participation of indigenous peoples in the policy and decision-making processes, negotiations, and mechanisms of various United Nations bodies, agencies, funds, and programs globally. Furthermore, the resolution instructs the President of Human Rights Council to organize an annual discussion on indigenous peoples' rights starting from 63rd session of the Human Rights Council in 2026. The theme for that particular session would be Convention for the Protection of World Cultural and Natural Heritage, Indigenous Peoples' Rights, and Engagement. The resolution also directs the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to ensure the full participation of indigenous women, youth, and persons with disabilities, and to prepare and present the summary report to the Human Rights Council in advance. This theme acknowledges the profound connections that indigenous peoples have with land, nature, and culture, and also highlights the importance of preserving these bonds with the global heritage and conservation discussions. Notably, the progress was also made in 2024, especially through major meetings where indigenous peoples representatives, governments, and UN bodies worked collaboratively. Therefore, the second importance of these resolutions basically recalls the roles played by the 4 major UN mechanisms related to indigenous peoples, especially the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and equally the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. Therefore, the resolution acknowledges their roles, especially in conducting the research, preparing the reports, ensuring Indigenous peoples' rights, and facilitating the participation of their representatives or Indigenous peoples' representatives in various United Nations meetings and conferences. Therefore, the resolutions basically commits them to enhance their cooperations and coordinations to work more effectively in securing or in ensuring the Indigenous peoples' rights or their participation in the policy discussions or decisions and access to the justice. This brings me to share the third aspect or third importance of these resolutions, which is what I say is crucial aspects of these resolutions, which basically calls on states to formally recognize, respect, and implement existing treaties, agreements, and other arrangements that concluded between the states and Indigenous peoples to ensure Indigenous peoples' rights. The resolutions also urges states to uphold, respect, and implement the rights enshrined in the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples that majority of countries around the world are parties. Similarly, the resolution also calls on states to ensure the participation of Indigenous peoples in international, regional, and national programs, plans, and strategies which actually aimed at fulfilling the commitments of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals. And the resolution also directs states to address all forms of violence and discrimination against Indigenous peoples, adopt appropriate measures to protect them from all forms of violence, investigate all human rights violations and abuses against them, hold perpetrators accountable, adopt appropriate measures for prevention, and ensure the effective remedies and reparations. Therefore, the resolution also notes the rises in the cases of threats, harassments, and reprisals against Indigenous human rights defenders and leaders across the world, especially the targeting to Indigenous women, representatives, and activists, and also strongly condemns these acts. The resolution also urges states to take measures to prevent such acts, investigate all allegations, provide effective remedies, and prevent their recurrences. During the occasion, the Sankar Limbu, the vice president of the Lawyers Association for Human Rights of Nepalese Indigenous peoples, also reported on the discriminations and the violence faced by Indigenous peoples of Nepal during the Human Rights Council sessions this year.
As a practicing lawyer, I have serious doubts about labeling hydro projects as a clean energy in the context of just equity and just transition in Nepal. Gross human rights violations are all justified in the name of development. Most of hydro projects are located on Indigenous peoples' territories, seem serving of both means and ends of the colonization. Nepal's so-called just transition continues to undermine Indigenous peoples' sovereignty, self-determination, autonomy, customary self-governance, while grabbing our lands, territories, and resources without free, prior, and informed consent. Is this a justice? Absolutely not. It's a million-dollar question. Is there any space for a justice when Indigenous peoples forced to live at a gunpoint? How can our communities survive when hydropower projects destroy our sacred mountains, rivers, forest heritages, and entire civilizations? When communities raise the concerns, no one listens. When we protest, we are criminalized with disproportionate and severe punishment. Right now, 9 Limbu Indigenous youth are facing trial in the District Court of Taplejung for organizing peaceful protests to protect their sacred sites and the collective rights at the Upper Tamar hydro projects. The legal process is so costly that sooner or later, they may compel to sell their lands just to pay for the defense.
And the fourth aspect of the resolution is interagency coordination for various stages. For example, the resolution encourages coordination between the various human rights council mechanisms and the human rights treaty bodies to ensure the rights of indigenous peoples under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it also encourages states to seriously consider and implement the recommendations provided by these various treaty monitoring bodies regarding the indigenous peoples' rights. Similarly, recalling that the rights of indigenous peoples outlined in UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples are referenced in the national laws and codes of various countries, the resolutions further encourages the translation of these declarations into the languages that indigenous peoples speak and understand, especially in their mother tongue. Similarly, the resolution also recalls the UN's declaration of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages from 2022 to 2032 and calls on a state and UN agencies, particularly UNESCO, to take concrete steps to implement the Global Action Plan regarding the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. It also calls on a state to formulate the national policies, funds, and programs to promote the indigenous run media and also enhance the capacity of indigenous journalists, encouraging the productions and dissemination of materials in various indigenous languages. And also noting that the climate change and loss of biodiversity and environmental pollutions that affect indigenous peoples, the resolution also urges states to promote indigenous peoples' traditional economies and also recognize their right to conserve their ancestral lands, territories, and natural resources. Therefore, because of all these reasons, this recent decision by the United Nations is a truly historic resolution for indigenous peoples around the world. So that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to see other videos prepared on indigenous peoples issues. We will see you in the next episode. Bye bye.